Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew Danieri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for this event today, Russia Reset Redux Business Bonanza or Bust. We're excited to have four top experts on Russia with us for this discussion today on the White House's proposed business reset with the Kremlin. And now I'm delighted to introduce our four panelists. We have Catherine Belton, an international investigative reporter with the Washington Post. We have Sir William Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. We have Janis Kluge, deputy head of the Eastern Europe and Eurasia Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And finally, Edward Verona, our very own non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So we have a little bit less than 60 minutes for a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. I'll kick things off with our panelists and encourage everyone watching at home to submit your questions throughout the discussion by going to askac.org. That's askac.org to submit your questions, and I'll then pitch them to our panelists in the final 20 minutes of our conversation today. And with that, let's get into the topic at hand. Janis, I'm going to start with you. At the very top line level, can you lay out for our audience the main features of the Russian economy, including the elements that in principle would be attractive to Western firms?
Sure. Thank you very much. I think that this is very much a two-part answer. So if you abstract from everything political, so purely theoretically, Russia is a medium-sized economy. It has lots of resources. It has urbanized population. And in some areas, it has strong education, for example, in IT. And in an economy like this, in theory, there are opportunities for both trade and investment. And these are the sectors where US investment and trade was happening in the past. So energy, also chemicals, consumer goods and services, venture capital to some degree, banking. So US companies did have investments there. Some very few companies remain. But now, to the second part of the answer, the situation is just completely different now because of politics. And I would say that actually Russia right now is pretty much uninvestable. There are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that whatever Trump and Putin decide, Russia will at least partially remain under EU sanctions. So it will remain a heavily sanctioned economy. And for internationally operating businesses, this is a compliance nightmare, even if US lift some of their sanctions. Then we have seen over the last 3 years extreme violations of investor rights. So we had outright expropriations. And, as you might know, right now, it is almost impossible for investors to take out their capital from Russia. And, these kind of steps taken by the Russian government, they will scare off investors for a very long time. And it usually takes decades to regain the trust of investors. And, then, of course, the Russian economy right now is geared towards war. So the only part of the economy that is really growing rapidly, where there's a positive dynamic, is the military industry. And I don't think that the military industry would be a sector that, US companies would be interested or even allowed to invest in. They would certainly not be allowed to do that. The military industry is strictly nationalized in Russia. So overall, the future for the Russian economy for any investment looks bleak. The war is ongoing. We have an autocracy that is, could become unstable at any point. There's also no stability in US-Russia relations because also Trump could change his opinion at some point. So overall, for businesses, it is way too risky to go to Russia right now. And I have not even talked about all the rule of law issues that existed before the full-scale invasion. So that is probably something that Bill Browder and Catherine Belton can talk a lot about. So nobody would want to commit capital to Russia now. What is possible is, certain degrees of trade. So transactions that don't involve a big commitment. Russia is still a rather small market, but from the Russian side, they definitely urgently want to buy certain things. for example, airplane parts. They have a scarcity of airplane parts. They would really like to buy a lot of airplane parts from Boeing right now, to solve this problem created by sanctions. They would also like to stock up on spare parts and components for the military industry. And this is where I think the highest risk is, in any kind of deal that could happen, that the Russian side would offer to buy a lot of these things. And maybe at some point the US side would agree, and this would be, from my perspective, really dangerous. I stop here.
Thanks, Giannis. Yeah, and you actually teed up my next question. I want to go to two folks who've kind of been there and done it in the business environment in Russia. First, Sir William, you were at one point in time one of the top international investors in Russia. What's it like to be an investor in Russia under the Putin regime? And you're on mute right now.
I think Giannis used one word, which I will repeat, which is that Russia is uninvestable. Russia is a country where if you have a successful business and you're making money, then various vultures from the law enforcement and security establishment will come in and try to expropriate your business from you. And I'm probably the prime example of such a story. Of course, many people will know my story, which is that I was once the largest foreign investor in Russia, and the authorities raided my office, seized all of our documents, and then used those documents in a complex fraud to steal $230 million of taxes that my firm paid to the Russian government. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed the crime, and after testifying against the officials involved, he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed. And then they went after me and everybody connected to me in every possible way, chasing us around the world with Interpol arrest warrants and so on, and trying to blame us for the crime they committed. And I went around telling this story for a long time, and everybody tried to, and this was during the heyday of Russia when there was still sort of a, quote, positive investment environment. And to the extent that it was possible, people tried to dismiss my story and say, well, this is Browder, he was a troublemaker, he was attracting too much attention to himself, he was complaining about corruption openly, he deserved whatever happened, you have to just play by their rules, etc. And various people who were playing by their rules then had the same thing happen to them. And of course, the most famous subsequent case was the Mike Calvi case, Bering's Vostok, in which he was one of these guys who was really like a big promoter of Russia after I was kicked out. And he was arrested along with all of his colleagues and spent some time in jail and has actually just written a book, which I haven't yet started, but I'm looking forward to talking about his experience. But basically, there's just no way you can do this in Russia. You cannot go to Russia, invest, and expect anything good to happen. Bad things will happen to you if you invest in Russia, and not just on a financial basis, but bad things can happen to you physically. You can either be killed, arrested, exiled, whatever, and there's no amount of money that's worth that for any Western company. And so my advice to anybody who's considering investing in Russia is lay down for 15 minutes and wait for the urge to pass, because nothing good is going to happen.
Very good. Thank you, Sir William. Ed, similar question to you. What's your experience been doing business in modern Russia?
There we go. Well, I'd say I'm in agreement with everything that Giannis and Bill have said, but I'll begin by taking exception to the use of the term modern Russia, and maybe it would be helpful to define what is a modern economic and business environment, and that would be for most business people a competitive free market, predominantly private sector economy, fairly diversified with some manufacturing. Service is a big component, agricultural production, and a mix of large, medium, and small-size enterprises, along with a well-defined legal and regulatory system and an independent judiciary that presides impartially over an established body of commercial law. And what I've just said is the exact opposite of the situation that exists in Russia, certainly today, and probably for most of the period of time we're discussing. Russia is a lopsided economy that is heavily oriented toward commodity-based industries, oil and gas, minerals, agricultural production, a high concentration of state-owned or controlled enterprises, with oligopolistic financial industrial groups accounting for a disproportionately large share of the economy. Medium and small-sized enterprises struggle to survive in that environment. The government exerts substantial control over the economy, and the judiciary, as has been mentioned, is subject to government interference in high-profile cases and manipulation in legal disputes between private parties. Corruption is, the joke is that the system isn't corrupt, that corruption is the system. When I was there, Russia was in the, say, 130 to 140 rank of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. That's out of 180 countries that they rate. It's actually gone down to about 156 out of 180. And those, 26 at the bottom are countries that don't have much of a track record attracting investment. Maybe another joke relevant from the 1990s was that when a Russian businessman had a dispute with a competitor, he didn't call a lawyer, he called a hitman. Those days, thankfully, ended more or less at around the turn of the last century as business consolidated, large state-owned enterprises in transition gradually came under the control of individuals who exerted some proprietorial control. But that isn't to say that coercion and selective enforcement of the law didn't continue, and it made life very difficult for legitimate businesses. And I think it's been alluded to already, certainly Bill did, but I'll name a few of the high-profile cases. Some date back, but I think it's worth reminding people. Yukos, which was once the, say, leading blue chip Russian company traded on the New York Stock Exchange, was dismantled in a forced bankruptcy from 2003 to 2006. And everyone, I think, knows that that was part of a concerted effort to teach a lesson to the Russian business class to stay out of politics, as Mikhail Khodorkovsky seemed to be doing. Another was the beneficiary of that forced bankruptcy, by and large, was a Russian state-controlled enterprise, Rosneft. In 2015, Bashneft belonged to another financial industrial group. It was owned by AK Sistema, and it was forced to divest. Pромsvязьbank, large financial industrial group, expropriated from its owners. Summa Corporation, one of the larger enterprises, same thing. And even more recently, we've seen shades of what was called the Wild East in the Wildberries case.
Yeah.
Wildberries is a telecoms company, and it involved a shootout between competing clans in a square on the very outskirts, right next to the Kremlin wall. And another example of how business disputes can be resolved.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I would encourage everyone watching online to look up the Wildberries case if you have not. The 90s are very much back in a sense when you read about that case. Catherine, I want to turn to you now. You've written a great deal about the Russian oligarch class and their influence in Russia and abroad. The Eurasia Center, of course, has taken to calling some of these folks Kremligarchs because they derive their wealth from their connections to the Kremlin rather than any meaningful business acumen. But just talk a little bit about just how dominant are oligarchic interests in Russian politics and the economy.
Well, Kremlin-Gark is exactly the right term because nowadays, of course, the oligarchs don't exist as they did in the 90s when you had powerful billionaires dictating their will to the Kremlin. Right now, it's the opposite, beginning from the well-known case against Mikhail Khodorkovsky and the Russian state takeover of Yukos. That sent a signal to the entirety of the Russian billionaire class that they had to toe the line for the Kremlin. Otherwise, they could face the same fate, i.e., years in jail, state bankruptcy of their companies, and takeover expropriation, essentially. So from then on, all Russian billionaires obeyed the Kremlin's orders. They obeyed Putin's orders. And one prominent Russian billionaire who made all his money in the 90s told me, he said, basically, if I get a call from the Kremlin saying you have to spend $1 billion on this or that strategic project, I can't refuse, I have to comply. So they're all essentially arms of the Kremlin. And so if you take that as your base case scenario, this really means that there is one dominant Kremlin-Gark, and that is Vladimir Putin himself. He controls most of the strategic economy. In that case, he's very dominant indeed, because these billionaires who you might think are independent, profit-motivated operators, of course, they're interested in profits, but they also have a strategic agenda. And that's one of the reasons why the sanctions have been very important, the Western sanctions, because otherwise, without Western sanctions, at least impinging on some of the Russian billionaires' ability to do business, they would be more free to follow Putin's orders, fund the Kremlin war machine, and also spend their wealth to subvert our Western democracies and try and undermine support for Ukraine.
Thanks, Catherine. So for this round, I want to move a little bit from describing the Russian economy to U.S. policy on Russia, and I want to go back to Yanis here. The Russian economy, which I know you've written about significantly, is not exactly healthy after 3 years of full-scale war and significant Western sanctions, but it still does have the resources and the firepower to prosecute its war against Ukraine. Is now the right time to be lifting sanctions on the Kremlin, as the Trump administration has talked about?
So, with regards to timing, I think it's mostly political. So you want to get a lot of concessions in return from Putin if you are planning to lift sanctions. But you will only get concessions if the sanctions are actually a problem for Putin. So in other words, if you plan to lift the sanctions, you want to do it in the moment when they have the highest leverage. And if you look back at the last 3 years, Russia survived the sanctions, mostly due to two reasons. The first one, especially in 2022, the energy prices were very high, record-breaking exports and fiscal revenue. And the second reason was Russia's economic model over the last 3 years, which can be described as military Keynesianism. So it is basically a lot of war spending that leads to job creation, low unemployment, and GDP growth. So this means that over the last 3 years, until now, there's not a lot of leverage that not a lot you can get in return for lifting sanctions from Putin. But now Russia is economically at a turning point. So we see that this model of military Keynesianism, it no longer works. Russia has a labor scarcity. So if it then spends more on the war, this just leads to inflation. And the military industry can only grow if the civilian part of the economy shrinks. And this means that there is no further GDP growth. We also see that fiscal space is becoming an issue for Russia. So Russia has to borrow more at very high interest rates. It has to increase taxes, and the National Welfare Fund, its most important fiscal buffer, is the liquid assets are almost exhausted. And finally, also the Russian energy exports are deteriorating even before the economic chaos that is probably going to happen in the next weeks and months, before the oil price fell like it did in the last week. So overall, if you take all of this together, Russia is probably looking at a recession this year, or maybe even a bigger economic crisis. Overall, I don't want to overpromise. This is not a collapse, but it is very likely that the economy will become a real headache for Putin this year and next year. So If you plan to lift sanctions, don't do it now because Putin doesn't have a lot of respect for sanctions at this point, and you will get a lot more in return for lifting sanctions in 1 or 2 years. In contrast, I would even say that right now is a very good window of opportunity to tighten sanctions because you will have an increased effect, and because the oil prices are relatively low, the risks of blowback to your own economy are relatively low as well. So this is a good opportunity to maximize the effect and get even more in return if you plan to actually lift sanctions.
Excellent. Thanks, Giannis. Ed, over to you now. The White House seems in fits and starts to be heading toward trying to reset relations with Russia, something previous US presidents have tried. What do you think the Trump administration should learn from these past attempted resets?
Well, maybe the easy answer is don't do them. Look, there have been two major resets that come to my mind. One was in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. The driver of that process for part of that time was the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission. There was full engagement across the breadth of U.S. government. It was focused on providing technical assistance. We also gave a lot of support to multilateral organizations and lending. And the thrust there was on structural adjustment, sectoral reform, helping really implement the so-called GAIDAR reforms, taking the country from a centralized state-planned economy to a free market over a 10-year period of time when oil and gas prices were at significantly lower than average levels. We did some advocacy on behalf of major projects like Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2, but it was really an engagement. There was as much of an intellectual exchange as anything, and the key to that was the receptivity of the government. I remember at the time I was at the U.S. Embassy, and it was possible for a relatively junior or mid-level foreign service officer to meet with ministers. They wanted to hear from us. They welcomed the engagement. The second reset was the red button перезагрузка during the Obama administration. That was much more focused on encouraging private sector investment, and not only U.S. in Russia, but Russian companies in the United States. And there were some significant examples where that occurred. There was less emphasis on technical assistance, and that reflected the fact that Russian authorities really, by that time, and this was well into the Putin era, didn't really want to hear what we had to say about reform. I guess they decided where they wanted to take the country. They were happy to have foreign investment, but they didn't want the cod liver oil that went along with it. So the lesson for me is, to the extent that you can actually accomplish something, such resets have to be in a conducive environment. And a reset will be just window dressing for some political rapprochement. I don't believe Russia is today receptive to that, and I think that we would have a hard time trying to influence a highly crony-based and corrupt business model that's really a fundamental characteristic of the Putin regime.
Thanks, Ed. Sir William, White House officials have variously said they take Putin at his word in negotiations. President Trump himself has suggested that Putin wouldn't dare to double-cross him personally in negotiations, whether that's over Ukraine or other business deals. Given your experiences in Russia, as well as you mentioned Michael Calvi earlier, to name one example, what do you think of this approach?
Well, I think it's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. My blood was boiling when I heard Steve Witkoff talking about how he respected Putin, he could be trusted, he had good meetings with him, he admired him, all this type of stuff. And of course, similar sentiments coming from the president are equally upsetting. Vladimir Putin is a KGB killer. I've seen him kill. I've seen him steal money. I've seen him cover up crimes. And anybody else who spent any time looking at Russia has had the same, has witnessed the same things. It's absurd, and it's offensive to have people say that type of stuff. And furthermore, I mean, these people either are the most cynical people out there or the stupid people out there, because it doesn't take it takes us a quick Google search to come up with all the crimes that Putin has committed and so on. And so for anybody to say that he can be trusted is just I mean, it's just absurd and very, very unhelpful. But we're living in a world where President Trump wants to bend reality to his will, and he's done so in a number of occasions. The whole January 6th thing, it wasn't a bunch of it wasn't like a bunch of love that was being expressed, but he was able to convince a significant part of the country that it was, after repeating the same thing over and over again. And he seems to be trying to do the same thing with Vladimir Putin. And, I don't think I need to convince anybody here that Vladimir Putin is a terrible man, that he's a criminal. I think everybody knows that. But, what will happen if you have the charismatic, persuasive leader of the free world repeating this stuff over and over again? And a lot of people who aren't paying a lot of attention to this stuff will start to believe it. And of course, that will have very negative repercussions for Ukraine, negative repercussions for the security of Europe, and ultimately negative repercussions for America. So I'm very upset by this whole thing, and I'm having a hard time coming to terms with it, because America used to be the most stalwart in my ally to me in my work trying to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky, trying to contain Russia, and trying to impose sanctions on people who do bad stuff there. And everybody else was sort of going along slowly. America was always leading, and now we have America leading in the other direction, and I find it very upsetting.
Catherine, over to you for, I want to hear about the Russian reaction to some of the effusive comments we've heard from the White House. What do you think Russian elites and oligarchs are thinking when they see enthusiasm from the White House about growing U.S.-Russia business ties?
Well, I think we've seen them cheering, and you can see that very clearly in the reaction of the Russian stock market, which has been up nearly 20% since Trump was re-elected in November. Since January, since the Trump-Putin phone call, it's up nearly 11%. That's been tailing off lately, in particular since the Trump tariffs have started to hit the oil price. But overwhelmingly, we've seen a cheer. I spoke to one of the most closely linked Kremlin billionaires, Konstantin Malafeyev. He was cheering. This was already hours before the Trump-Putin phone call. He was cheering the arrival of Donald Trump as heralding the onset of this new era in which great powers get to divide up the world between themselves and essentially ride roughshod over international law. And he was saying then that sort of Trump's claims on Greenland, on Gaza, were a big sign of this, that, he said, if Trump wants us to recognize the US claims on Greenland, then of course they have to recognize our claims on Ukraine, and they're already kind of licking their chops. And you see essentially their reaction personified in the activities of Kirill Dmitriev, who is officially Putin's international economic envoy, who was in DC just last week meeting Steve Witkoff and a bunch of other officials, including Mark Rubio. There was a temporary lifting of sanctions for him just to make that visit. But unofficially, he has been, since 2016, Putin's envoy to the Trump team. And we saw how they're really following a playbook now that was first cultivated back then in the Robert Mueller investigation into Russian interference. We saw Kirill Dmitriev peddling the same lines when he was making approaches to the Trump team in November 2016, first through George Nada. He was seeking meetings meetings, which he eventually got in the Seychelles with Eric Prince. Apart from the only difference then was this was all done in secret. Now we can see it openly. And he was also seeking meetings with Jared Kushner, which he eventually got, and he was passing on plans then for a big reconciliation between the US and Russia, in which there would be win-win economic initiatives. So we're seeing this play out all over again. Apart from this time, it looks like he's going to be much more successful. I'm not sure the Russian billionaires are too keen to have foreign investors present in their economic patch again, but they are keen to see funding and bank financing flow back in. And of course, they want to start enjoying their yachts and mansions abroad all over again.
All right. You're watching Russia Reset Redux, Business Bonanza or Bust on the implications of a US business reset with Russia. A reminder to our online audience to get your questions in to askac.org. I have one more round of questions for our panelists, and then it'll be your turn. So keep them coming to askac.org. Giannis, you are stateside at the minute, but based in Berlin. How does Europe view the idea of economic reintegration with Russia?
So I think that the situation in Europe is different from the US in two major ways. The first difference is that for Europe, Russia is a much more direct threat. On the one hand, there is an intense hybrid war ongoing, but Russia is also a military threat to Europe. This is particularly relevant against the background of questions regarding the US commitment in NATO. So Russia is a threat. And if you think about buying Russian energy, then you have to consider that every dollar you send to Russia will fund the Russian military. And this means that every dollar you send to Russia means you have to spend probably $2 in defense spending to make up for that. And that makes actually engagement with Russia very expensive. We also have to consider that every piece of technology that we deliver to Russia could end up in a Russian drone, and that then subsequently threatens us directly. So because of this, and I think that this general picture will remain, even if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, I find it hard to see significant sanctions relief happening from the side of the European Union. There are also formal principles when sanctions relief can happen. Russia would have to end its aggression, and this means retreating from all of Ukrainian territory, pay compensation, prosecute war crimes, and so on. And I think that this at this point is quite unrealistic. In that sense, the European Union is extremely very principled with regards to its sanctions policy. But there's also a second difference between the US and Europe with regards to economic ties to Russia. In the case of Europe, in particular in the case of a few countries in Europe, there are real economic incentives for re-engagement. Think about pipeline gas, which arguably could lower gas prices in Germany. And there are also established lobby networks, between business people and politicians. And, I was shocked to see that many of these networks are coming back to life now after 3 years of war. And what has triggered them, what is bringing them back to life is the prospect of Trump doing a deal. And then there are also pro-Russian governments within the EU. And this makes the European sanctions consensus fragile. So while on the one hand, the EU is very principled and unlikely to really change, there's a risk that the sanctions consensus could fall apart. And I think that if the US lifts sanctions, this could be destabilizing European sanctions as well. For example, Hungary could then opt to block the next extension of the sanctions. We need consensus within the EU every 6 months to just keep the sanctions going. We will also see industry actors in Germany, in other countries, demanding the same rights like US companies of re-engaging with Russia. And some politicians in European countries will say, we need to give up sanctions. In particular, if there is now an economic crisis because of tariffs, times are hard. This has not worked. So this argument could really strengthen if the US lifts its sanctions. So I think that it would have a very detrimental effect on Europe.
Thanks very much. All right, so we've had the view from Europe. Ed, to you, how would a US-Russia reset advance American interests? Is there a conflict between these advances toward Moscow and the White House's stated goal of peace in Ukraine?
Well, I guess it depends on on who defines what those interests are. I've always understood them to mean upholding the principles of democracy, of sovereignty, territorial integrity, not disrupting the world order that by and large has ensured a period of 80-year period of peace between major powers, certainly in the European continent. But would would a reset benefit the United States in some way? Certainly not until, in my understanding of what our interest is, that maybe not consistent with what the view is coming from Washington, D.C. today, but it would not behoove us to have a reset until there is a just and sustainable resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war. And that, as Yanis and Catherine have alluded to, entails I would think reconstruction of Ukraine following the enormous damage that has been done by the Russian invasion, an accounting for the war crimes that have occurred. I think a reset, yes, would imply a lifting or lessening of the current sanctions regime. I think that's depending on the sequencing of that. If we lose the leverage that it provides us before we actually achieve anything, that would not be a good thing. So if it is a commercial reset, trying to repeat what was achieved under the previous resets, large-scale U.S. investment, I don't see that happening, particularly in the areas that have been talked about as part of this new reset, which is rare earths, critical raw materials, oil and gas. In any of those areas, you're talking about major projects that require significant upfront capital costs and recoupment periods that can be as long as a decade or more. We had Sakhalin 1, Sakhalin 2. They were sort of the flagship major oil and gas investment projects in Russia during the previous reset. They were technical successes, but in both cases, they were subject to shakedowns, most spectacularly in the case of Sakhalin 2, where Gazprom, once it saw that it was up and running, decided they didn't want to have foreign companies controlling a major export capacity for gas. So they used a bunch of pretexts to force the companies in that consortium to turn over half of the equity to Gazprom at a relatively almost a trifling cost. So would there be other companies prepared to do that? Memories are short, but not when companies have had to write off multi-billion-dollar projects, and not when they know that the recoupment would not occur in a period shorter than a decade, maybe a little less, but still a long period. So I don't see the prospects of that.
Okay. Yeah, Ed, part of your answer there anticipated my final question for Catherine. So I want to go to her now, and then we'll close out with the moderated portion of our conversation with Sir William. And Catherine, my question to you is somewhat similar to what Ed touched on. Under what circumstances do you think it would make sense for the US to meaningfully engage Russia economically or commercially?
It's very difficult to say under the current leadership, because even if Putin were to agree to some kind of ceasefire and then suddenly the Trump administration agrees to lift some of the sanctions, I think it would be very risky for any Western business to go back in. I've been speaking to some of the American businessmen who are seasoned investors there, and even if there were to be some kind of peace agreement, they fear if they're coming back back in with billions of dollars in investment. The minute there's a change of administration, Putin is going to launch another war somewhere else, and it's all bets are off, and they're having to write off billions of dollars in investments all over again. And indeed, we saw this in one FSB linked document that we got hold of at the Washington Post. We reported on this document that was written by an FSB linked think tank for the Kremlin administration, and it was obtained by a European intelligence service. And basically in that it said, without international recognition of Russia's takeover of the occupied territories in Ukraine, then in quotes, it's fairly likely that conflict will resume all over again, for instance, when the next US administration changes. So they have no intention of stopping where they are at the moment, even if there's a brief pause in the conflict. So I think it's very difficult to be engaging under those circumstances. And if, for instance, you have like oil service companies like Schlumberger coming back in, then there's a great risk that Russia just uses all the revenues, as it has done in the past, from its oil industry to fund its war machine. So yeah, there's even if the war was over under the current FSB-led regime, then you know what's going to happen to your assets the minute that somebody in the security services wants a piece of the action. It will be taken over, and you'll end up with a fate like Bill Browder's.
You guys are perfectly teeing me up here. Sir William, you get the final word on the moderated portion of our conversation. If the Trump administration continues its Russia reset policy, can Western businesses and investors expect fair treatment upon entering or re-entering Russia?
No, not at all. They say the definition of insanity is keeping on to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. We've had 25 years or more of these types of stories, of the story that I experienced, that the stories that Ed has talked about, the stories that Catherine has talked about. I mean, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I was a very high-profile victim of this whole horrific regime, and so as a result, I ended up getting approaches from just about everybody who's had problems. And I mean, I've been approached by so many people. You know, we read the stories about the ones that have been in the newspapers, but for every story in the newspaper, there's 10 more stories, heartbreaking stories that haven't been in the newspaper, of the most unbelievable things that have happened to foreigners, to Russians, to everybody. It's just, it's like a absolute exercise in masochism for anybody to go to Russia. It makes no sense whatsoever, and so but for some reason people just keep on sort of, you know, forgetting about what's happened in the past and saying, well, maybe this time it's different. Well, it's not different. This time it's the same, and it's always been the same. And as I said before, you don't just risk losing your money, but you risk losing your life. And there's no amount of money that makes that worthwhile. And you know, I often go and lecture about my story to students. And back in the days before the war started, you know, I would find myself in a high school or a university where there'd be a Russian kid comes up to me, a smart Russian kid, and they say, I heard your story. I'm so inspired by your story. I'd like to go back to Russia and try to change it from within. And what do you advise? And my answer was, my advice to you is don't go, because one of two things will happen. If you try to, you know, change Russia, you try to become a member of the opposition or expose corruption or stand up against, you know, the regime in some way, you'll be arrested at best, and perhaps worse things will happen to you. The alternative for you, if you want to survive in Russia, is to become a criminal. If you become a criminal, you can survive. And so you either have the choice of being arrested and killed, or the choice of becoming a criminal. Probably best just to stay out of the place. And that's for, of course, the Russian who has some connection to the country. But for a foreigner, there's absolutely no reason to go anywhere near that place. And so my advice is stay away.
All right, and with that, we're going to move to audience Q&A. If you're in the audience, please keep sending in your questions. I'll keep taking them. We got 13 minutes left in our discussion here. The first question goes to Giannis. This one is from Pablo Avila, who asks, how long can Russia keep up its military Keynesianism, and can Russia survive off its military industrial complex in the long term?
I think that Russia can keep up spending on the military, but the price for doing so will increase. So one part of the price has been inflation, and inflation has grown despite very high interest rates in Russia. And this means that if you're a Russian, your mortgage rate is 30% right now, or you cannot afford to buy a new car, for example. We've seen that the Russian car market has essentially halved over the last year. So these very high interest rates are extremely painful, at least for some parts of the population. So Putin can continue to do it, but there will also be losers from this policy, and there will be more tensions within Russia, more trade-offs politically. He cannot keep spending on the military the same way, and also spend on social transfers and keep everybody happy. So I still believe that he would be willing to pay this kind of price. But as I said, it would get more difficult. I think that we should not look for a certain time frame. This is not, how it will be, that there's a certain point in time when simply, Putin will stop doing that. But as I said, the price will go up, and with that, if the price continues to go up, we might reach a point in the future where it is easier to deal either with Putin or maybe at some point with his successor in trying to resolve this conflict.
Thanks. The next one, I think this one should be for Catherine, and Sir William, feel free to chime in here as well. This one comes from Michael Wasira at The Insider, who asks, does Putin understand that an economic system based on rentier kleptocracy and military spending is not conducive to the promotion of general societal well-being? If he does understand this, then why is he continuing to pursue the policies that you so accurately describe?
Because he considers his own well-being probably good for the general society, because he sees himself as the leader of the Make Russia Great Again movement. And his doctrine has been that to do that, he has to basically capture all of Russia's strategic cash flows and then use it, one, to fund his war machine, and two, to try and subvert democracies elsewhere so that he can capture control of them. So it's a very different model, unfortunately. I mean, he could choose to make Russia great again by sponsoring a competitive economy, but he's chosen the opposite path of that.
Sir William, anything for you to jump in on there?
Well, I would just echo a couple of things that Catherine says, that Putin, he doesn't care about anything other than his own survival. I don't think I'd slightly disagree with Catherine. I don't think he wants to make Russia great at all. I think he just wants to make Putin great at the expense of everybody. His whole objective is, he started out his presidency trying to steal as much money as possible. And after stealing just an unbelievable amount of money, he realized that he had stolen too much money and that the people would come for him eventually. And so he then created a war to divert people's attention away from him towards a foreign enemy. And so this is not about anything other than Vladimir Putin and his personal survival. And that's all he cares about. And he's in a position where he's ready to sacrifice everything, the economics of his country, the people of his country, just to stay in power and to stay alive.
Thank you both. Ed, the next question's to you. It comes from Nicole Young, who asks, how sustainable is Russia's economic pivot toward non-Western markets, such as China and India, in response to sanctions?
I suppose it means it is sustainable at a very low level. The cost of exporting I mean, they've destroyed their most lucrative export market, Western Europe. The pipelines were designed to export to that market. They got the highest return on the investment. After the 2014 sanctions packages were implemented, Putin rushed to Beijing to try to bring to a closure the negotiations that have been going on for a decade with the Chinese over an export pipeline to China. No one really knows what that deal consists of, what price they agreed upon, but I think everyone agrees China was in the best position, had enormous leverage, and Russia was a price taker. China financed the construction of the pipeline, and whatever revenues come out of that today probably goes to service the cost of building the pipeline, and it'll be many, many years before they actually have any surplus revenue. In order to export oil to the markets that still accept it, and there's questions whether India is continuing to receive Russian oil, they've had to buy 300 or more old tankers, now deemed the shadow fleet, and ship the oil around the Cape of Good Hope at enormous cost, with more and more restrictions on where those ships can dock or be serviced. So I don't know if that's going to hold up very well, especially if we see a further softening of oil and gas prices.
Thanks very much. Giannis, back to you. A question from Amanda Wilson, who asks about sanctions. How effective have U.S. sanctions been in constraining the Russian economy since 2014, and especially after the full-scale 2022 invasion of Ukraine?
Well, in 2014, there were external conditions which made it easier to be successful with sanctions. So we had a downturn in the oil price in 2014 that had a significant negative effect on Russia. And this then came on top of the effect of the sanctions, which of course were much more benign than the sanctions that were imposed in 2022. One of the problems is that Russia gained a lot of experience in dealing with sanctions in the 8 years afterwards. So it had a light sanctions regime. It sort of built, some mechanisms to get around sanctions, and this made it a bit harder to sanction Russia in 2022. I think that the sanctions imposed in 2022 were moderately successful. Again, at that time, the external conditions were very good for Russia. So we had very high energy prices, and Russia had record revenues, which made it easier for Russia to sort of cushion the blow. But if you look at certain sectors of the Russian economy, we can see very strong effects of these sanctions, especially in combination with the European sanctions and the sanctions of other Western countries. So we see, that the production in the car industry has collapsed. We see that the coal industry is struggling. We see, as was mentioned by Edward, the problems in exporting oil, where Russia has to accept high discounts. There are a lot of problems that Russia has that are related to sanctions. It was just able to compensate for a lot of that due to very favorable external conditions. And so in general, I think that there is still some potential to tackle. I think that this would be the perfect time to do that, to list more ships of the Shadow Fleet, and maybe to tell India to not to buy less Russian oil, and then I think the effect of the sanctions could go from moderate to strong. And I think that if Donald Trump wants to get a deal done, that this would be required. This would be necessary to do.
All right, I have one final question here that I think lends itself to a speed round with everyone giving their answers. So we'll try to stick to under a minute, quick kind of reactions to this question from Mikhail Orlov, who asks, if economic ties with Russia are restored, what sorts of mechanisms could be put in place to ensure good behavior on behalf of on the Russian side? Who wants to lead off with that? Maybe Catherine, can I pick you first?
I'm not sure there are any mechanisms beyond imposing sanctions all over again. I mean, what's to stop the bad behavior otherwise? I'll leave that very short.
All right, any other bright ideas, Ed?
There's been talk about creating so-called snapback sanctions. If we granted some sanctions relief and Russia failed to comply with the conditions of that could quickly be snapped back. I'd say, that was a mechanism used in the case of Iran. I don't know that there's any snapback that's going to have much impact. I agree with Catherine. I just can't imagine what there would be unless you can take hostages. I mean, I don't know. That's maybe there's some sort of investment that Russia might make that it would fear losing of. I mean, that's Putin's mentality is, reciprocity. I take hostages and then I trade them for the people you arrest. Of course, their hostages tend to be normal citizens, journalists. Our hostages are, well, people we arrest for criminal activities and spying. I don't know that there's anything that would be effective.
Sir William?
The only thing I would add to what I agree with everything that's been said is that I don't even know why there's even a conversation about restoring Russia's access to anything and reducing sanctions. I mean, Putin has committed an unbelievably grave crimes against innocent people and of Ukraine. He's broken international law. He's indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. There's no moment, there's not a single reason whatsoever under any circumstances to reduce sanctions on Russia. That he's not done anything to deserve it. And the idea that it's even being considered makes no sense whatsoever. I find it hard to believe that there's even a consideration of this.
Giannis, last word, 30 seconds.
Okay, so I think that at this point, sanctions are not a deterrent for Putin. So if you want to deter further aggression, you have to build up your military, you have to build up your defenses, and you have to make sure that Ukraine has the tools to fight back in case Putin attacks. So I think that sanctions are more of a long-term tool at this point.
Fantastic. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you to our excellent panelists, Catherine Belton, Sir William Browder, Giannis Kluge, and Ed Verona, for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We really appreciate it. And for our audience, please check out the Atlantic Council's website for more on Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the whole Eurasia region. And while you're there, look up the Eurasia Center's Path-Breaking Russia Tomorrow series for all our latest analysis on Russia and its future. Thank you all for watching.